The baby was 7 months old when my milk started to slow. I remember standing at the kitchen window in the early morning, the house still dark except for the lamp on the counter, listening to her fuss and pull and come away hungry. My body was exhausted in a way I had no language for. Not tired, something deeper. Something that had been building since the birth. Since the birth before that, since the first year of our marriage when I learned that my body was not entirely my own anymore. I stood at that window and I thought, I think I am done. And then, before I had said a single word out loud, before I had told anyone, before I had even finished the thought, I felt afraid. Not of the baby going hungry, not of my milk drying up. Afraid of what my husband would say, afraid of what the community would say, afraid of what I was allowed to decide and what I was not. My name is Martha. I grew up Old Order Amish in Holmes County, Ohio. I left several years ago, and I am still learning the names for things that happened to me inside that life. This channel is where I say them out loud. If what I share here matters to you, subscribe and like this video, and tell me in the comments, did you know that Amish women have almost no say in how long they nurse? Because most people outside our world do not, and the ones inside it would never speak it. Let me tell you what breastfeeding means inside a plain community, not the soft version, the real one. In my church district, nursing a baby was not a choice a woman made. It was an expectation so deep it did not need to be spoken. The Ordnung, our unwritten code that governed everything from the color of our aprons to the length of our men's beards, said nothing directly about nursing. It did not need to. The silence around a woman's body always said enough. You nursed because formula was English. Formula was expensive, worldly, a sign of weakness or vanity or both. You nursed because the bishop's wife nursed. Because your mother nursed. Because every woman at every quilting frolic you had ever attended had nursed, and no one had ever in your hearing suggested there was another way, and you nursed for as long as your husband expected you to. That is the part that took me years of distance to see clearly. It was not the community alone that decided. It was the man in your house. And in my house, that man was Daniel. Daniel was not cruel in the way people imagine when they hear the word cruel. He did not shout. He did not strike. What he did was quieter than that, and in some ways harder to name, and in some ways harder to leave. He had opinions about my body that he held the way he held opinions about the farm, with calm certainty, as if the facts were simply obvious and disagreement was a kind of confusion on your part. He had decided, without discussing it with me, that I would nurse each child for at least 1 full year. This was not a conversation we had. It was a fact I discovered slowly, the way you discover the rules of a house only by accidentally breaking them. My first child, I nursed for 14 months. My body recovered. We moved forward. I thought nothing of it because I had nothing to compare it to. My second child was harder. The birth was harder. The recovery was longer. By 6 months I was losing weight I did not have to lose. I was waking every 2 hours through the night. I had a toddler underfoot and a farm to run and a husband who worked long hours and came home expecting supper on the table, and a wife who was present and capable and grateful. At 8 months I told Daniel I thought my body needed to stop. He looked at me the way he looked at the fields when the weather did not cooperate. Patient, certain, as if what I had said was simply a misunderstanding of how things worked. He said, "The baby needs another 4 months at least." I said, "I do not know if my body can give 4 more months." He said, "You will pray on it." And that was the end of the conversation, not because he locked a door or raised his voice. Because in my world, a wife who had been given an answer had been given all she was owed. You did not reopen a closed door. You prayed on it, which meant you accepted it, which meant you found a way. I want you to understand something about that moment, because it is easy from the outside to ask why I didn't simply stop, why I didn't make a different choice. And the answer is not that I was weak. The answer is that I had been shaped from birth to understand that my body's limits were a spiritual matter, not a medical one. That discomfort was not a reason. that my needs were not a reason, that a good wife yielded, that yielding was holiness, that asking for something different was asking to be less than what God intended. I did not have the word for what was happening to me. I did not have the word boundary. I did not have the word consent. I had the word endurance, and I used it like a roof over everything the rain was getting into. There is a part of this story I cannot tell you here. Not on this platform, not under these rules. The algorithm has limits, and I have learned exactly where they are. So I wrote the rest down instead, slowly, without the softening, without the cuts. Everything the camera is not permitted to show. The book is called The Ordnung They Never Wrote Down. 208 pages of what plain life looks like from the inside of it. The link is in the first comment of this video. That is where the part I could not say out loud lives. I nursed for 4 more months, 10 months in total for that child. My body did what I asked it to do because I asked it with desperation instead of choice. And when I finally stopped, the relief was so large it frightened me. Not joy, relief. The kind that tells you something was wrong even when you had been telling yourself it was fine. My neighbor Ruth stopped nursing at 5 months. Her 3rd child, her body had simply given out. She told me about it in a low voice while we were hanging laundry on her line, speaking toward the sheets so no one could see her mouth moving. She said her husband had not spoken to her for 3 days. 3 days of silence in a house where silence is already the primary language. 3 days of meals eaten without eye contact. 3 days of a man communicating, without a single word, that she had failed at something she owed him. She told me she apologized to him, that she had stood in the kitchen on the evening of the 3rd day and told him she was sorry for stopping too soon. I asked her what she was sorry for. She looked at me for a long time and said she did not know, only that the silence had to end. That is the thing no one outside our world understands about this kind of control. It does not need rules. It does not need enforcement. It lives in the silence, in the withdrawal, in the 3-day cold that teaches a wife that her body's limits are a transgression she is responsible for repairing. You do not need a lock on the door if the woman inside it has been taught to guard it herself. My 3rd child, something changed in me that I cannot entirely explain. I was 24 by then. I had been married 6 years. I had watched Ruth apologize for her own body. I had nursed 2 children past the point of exhaustion. And something inside me had gone very quiet. Not the good kind of quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when a person has been not heard for long enough that they stop expecting to be heard at all. I nursed my 3rd child for 3 months. At 3 months, my body stopped producing in any meaningful way. It was not a decision. It was a fact. The way a well runs dry. I told Daniel not when I stopped, but after. Days after. I had already switched to supplementing without telling him, the way a woman hides the truth not out of deception but out of survival. The way Ruth spoke toward the sheets. When I told him, his face did not change. He said, "You should have told me." I said, "I am telling you now." He said, "There are things a wife tells her husband when they happen, not when she has already decided." And there it was. The sentence I have turned over in my hands many times since leaving, because it contains the whole architecture of how our marriage worked. Not my body, not my supply, not my exhaustion or my health or my 3 months of trying. What mattered was the telling. What mattered was that decisions about my body traveled through him first. I want to say I argued back. I did not. I said something apologetic. I moved on to supper. The house kept running because the house had to keep running. When I left at 26, the shunning was swift. Meidung. Letters returned. Phone calls that rang out. My mother's voice the one time I reached her, careful and distant, the way you speak to someone who has chosen something that cannot be unchosen. My children were young. The leaving cost everything it was going to cost, and I paid it and I kept walking. In therapy, I learned the word for what Daniel did in those 3 days of silence. I learned the word for what it means when a person's access to their own body runs through someone else's permission. I learned that the exhaustion I had called endurance had a different name, and that the name did not make me weak for finally saying it. What I want you to hear, if you have come this far, is not that Amish men are monsters. Daniel was not a monster. He was a man who had been raised inside a system that told him his wife's body was a shared resource, and he believed it the way you believe something you have never been given reason to question. The monster, if there is one, is the silence. The system that gives a woman no medical information about her own supply, no permission to name her limits, no language for what her body needs, and then calls her failing a spiritual shortcoming. The system that teaches a husband his certainty is leadership, and his wife's exhaustion is a test of her faithfulness. The system where Ruth apologizes for a well that ran dry. I was not too young to nurse 3 children. I was too young to know that I was allowed to say, "This is what my body can give, and beyond this is not holiness, it is harm." I grieve the woman standing at that kitchen window in the early morning, afraid of a thought she had not yet spoken out loud. I grieve Ruth at the laundry line, speaking toward the sheets. I grieve every woman who was handed endurance in place of information, and told to call it faith. If you grew up in a world where your body's limits were someone else's decision, I see you. If you were taught that suffering quietly was the same as trusting God, I see you. Your body was never a debt. It was never a farm to be managed. It was yours. It always was, even when they told you otherwise. If you want to read the version of this story that YouTube will not allow, the full pages are in the Ordnung they never wrote down. First comment of this video. And that is everything. Choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.